Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode of Cerberus at the Improv. I'm Payman Ascari. Everyone is familiar with Timothy Knight and Andre Milosh, but today we have Mr. Leighton Grey with us. Leighton, welcome.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
That's very kind of you, as always. I appreciate it when you lie to my face. I'm sure, I'm sure it's torture being here.
I'm a truth speaker. Come on.
Jokes aside, I thought maybe we could jump right into it, and I'll put to you the question that we want to kind of start the episode is what is going on in Canada generally, but specifically with Bill C2, C8, C9, and if you want to throw in there Bill 63, the precursor to that. What is the Leighton Grey view on these things?
Well, what Canadians need to understand is this is a whole suite of legislation that is designed to not only destroy and dismantle freedom of speech in our country, but also, but more importantly, to control the way that we think and communicate with each other. G.K. Chesterton was a great writer, Christian and conservative writer of the 20th century. As you know, Payman, he's very quotable. One of the things he said is that there's a thought that stops thought. And this is the end. This is the essence of censorship. This is where censorship goes. It starts with, restricting what you say, but then the ultimate goal is to actually change the language and to remove the words that we've used to communicate with each other. And I happen to think this is the real purpose of these bills. And what's interesting about these bills is, let's face it, I'm not spilling the tea here. Canada has a lot of problems. Canada is a very, very sick society right now. And there are countries and people around the world who are noticing it and commenting on it. We have a lot of economic problems. We have a lot of social problems. I just read yesterday that we have over 3 million temporary residents in Canada, many of whom are not documented. That's 1 in 13 people in Canada. We've got problems in terms of trade. We've got problems in terms of defense. We have an ongoing conflict now with our deepest trading partner, most important neighbor, the United States. So here, and 4 million people using food banks. And so it begs the question, with all of this going on, with all of this important work for the Liberals to do, why are they so focused upon introducing a whole panoply of laws that are designed to restrict and punish our speech? And the answer is actually pretty simple. If you look at history, we are in some stage of totalitarianism in Canada. We started out as a Christian nation, as a free and democratic society. People who want to disagree with me about the Christian part should look at the original 1880 French lyrics to our national anthem, which actually read like a prayer. The first English translation was done by a doctor in Toronto. And so if you don't believe me, look that up. You could Google it. Canada is a Christian nation. And a lot of our success in terms of guaranteeing our rights and freedoms and civil liberties has stemmed from that. The recognizing the fundamental dignity of the individual, of families, of communities. But we're in a stage of totalitarian drift, and totalitarian drift has certain hallmarks. One of them is gun confiscation. One of them is restriction of religious liberty, which we saw during COVID, and we're seeing expanded even further. The other is destruction of economic freedom, and we're seeing that in our country. And then another one that we're seeing is, of course, this restriction of speech. And the goal is to remove, I think, from the language and from our understanding in Canada, the very character of our nation. And I think this is the goal. And so, I say, and I put this out there, and I'm happy to debate this with the members of this panel if they disagree with me, that Canada is fundamentally a Christian nation founded on Christian principles. But this government is trying to replace that religion with a new religion, and that religion is power. And in my view, empires no longer build cathedrals, they build programs. And in Mark Carney's Canada, faith has become this new instrument of policy. It's a language of inclusion turned into a mechanism of control. And that's really what these bills are about. So Carney and his ministers and Trudeau before him spoke of compassion, of reconciliation, and multi-faith partnership. But beneath all of this, the sort of hymns of harmony, there's an older ambition, and that's to make every creed serve the state. And so this is not really a war on religion. It's a war. It's becoming a war through religion. And it's a government using the symbols of virtue to sanctify obedience. And they've got their own politics of piety. And this gets at, for example, Bill C9, which essentially removes the objective criteria for what we used to call hate speech. And our Supreme Court has defined this. But of course, the liberals they've decided to ignore that definition, which was in itself pretty liberal. And what they've done is they've made a god of emotivism, of emotion. So if I say something that offends somebody, that can be sanctioned criminally. They can complain about it. And they've removed an important protection. There used to be ministerial protection. We can debate whether how much of a protection that is these days, but it used to be that somebody couldn't be prosecuted for hate speech. You think of someone like back in the day, Ernst Zundel or Jim Keegstra, for example, famous cases back in the 1980s of hate speech. Those you couldn't just complain to a police officer that someone offended you and hurt your feelings. Well, now you can. And so again, what they're doing is creating an environment in Canada that is strange to those of us who remember Canada as being a different place. We're essentially pitting Canadians against each other. And the goal, I think, is to concentrate more and more power in the federal government. So, in the name of diversity, new agencies fund religious and cultural councils, which would say that they're building community trust. But I don't see any of this community trust actually developing. And so, really, what Carney's doctrine seems to be is the gospel of managed consent. So, rules are flexible enough to please every ideology. Regulations are firm enough to bind every citizen, and that's really what these speech laws are doing. And so it's kind of a theology of governance, and so I think my big concern is there's a huge human cost coming here, and we're already starting to feel it. And there's a reckoning. I mean, my friend John Carpe recently published a piece. He's the head of the JCCF, saying he thinks by Christmas that we could be fully, living in a totalitarian state. And what's coming, if they can ram these bills through, is by Christmas they want to have this new community engagement directives. They're going to roll these out, and they will say equity but mean enforcement. They'll say dialogue but they'll mean data collection. They will say trust but they'll mean tracking. And when resistance rises, Carney's press will call it extremism. And so this modern state, it doesn't burn heretics anymore. It just reclassifies them. And that's really what these terms like hate speech and everything else are all about. So really we're at a crucial moment. This has been coming for a long time, but what I see with this suite of bills is it goes hand in hand with what the goal of the Liberal government is, and that's to essentially concentrate all power in our country, not in the people where it belongs. That's the essence of our history and the common law, but in a group of elites who will actually obviate the relevance of provinces. That's part of their goal too. That's why they have this national economy that they're legislating. And I think really what their goal is to rewrite the Canadian Constitution through judicial activism. And that answers a question that you might be asking, well, why is all this happening now? Well, the time is right because they've stacked the courts. And these courts are very ready to do whatever the Liberal government asks them to do, even if it means, for example, reinterpreting what the notwithstanding clause means. So this operates on many levels. And it's interesting that very little media attention is being devoted to these bills. That's a big concern. It shouldn't surprise anyone. But the other thing that bothers me is I don't hear any of the premiers going after these bills either. I don't hear a lot of debate about this in the House of Commons. Most of the discussion during question period surrounds Carney's failures in terms of economic policy. Now, those are real and those are tangible and they play well, on the internet in terms of sound bites. But in my opinion, the most dangerous, the most important legislation that this government is trying to push through right now is this suite of bills, C2, C8, C9. Now what they've done is they've split C2 into C2 and C12. That's a little game, divide and conquer. They're splitting up the bill into parts that they can ram through right away, and the parts that are looked to Orwellian are being held for later, for dessert, as it were. And then there's Bill C63 as well. So, but these bills are very, very crucial. I've been talking a lot about them on my show and elsewhere because, unfortunately, these are not being discussed enough. And these bills actually have the potential to obviate many of the protections that are in the Constitution in terms of religious freedom, freedom of speech, and also life, liberty, and security of the person. Because if we live in a society where our words are violence and we can be jailed for them, that presents a very dangerous situation. And where we're going, I'm just going to finish off on this point and then bounce it back to you, Payman, is the British experience shows us what's ahead. And I'm just going to give your listeners just a few tangible examples of what this looks like, boots on the ground. There's a man named Harry Miller in Britain. He was a former policeman. He was investigated in 2019 for retweeting a limerick, that's a type of a poem, that mocked radical gender theory. And the police recorded a quote unquote non-crime hate incident in his file and told him that they needed to check his thinking. In 2010, Paul Chambers, another Briton, made a sarcastic joke on Twitter about blowing up an airport after his flight was canceled. That's one that many of us have joked about. Anyway, he was arrested, he was fined, and he lost his job. He was ultimately acquitted at trial, but only after irreparable damage was done to his reputation. Now, that's one that would catch a lot of people. In 2020, a lady named Kate Scottow in Britain was detained and held for questioning because she misgendered someone online, and her children were left unattended as police seized all of her devices. And this goes even further. British street preachers have been hauled off for reciting Bible verses in public. Even football fans are arrested now for chants and tweets. And in a single year, British police, they recorded over 120,000 non-crime hate incidents and arrest over 3,000 people for what they call grossly offensive posts. And that language is similar to what is being imported into Canada. And here's the most shocking one, and I'll just finish here. Britain actually tops the list of countries with the highest number of arrests for online comments in 2023 with 12,183. Now, I'm going to make this point about the importance of Christianity to freedom here with an exclamation point. The lowest number on a list of nations who were canvassed in this list is Hungary. So in 2023, Great Britain, which gave us the common law and the English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, had over 12,183 arrests. Hungary had 10. And the rest of the list looks like this. The Belarus at 6,200. I'll just give you some of the highlights. Germany 3,500. China, communist China only had 1,500. Russia only 400. Poland, which is another openly Christian country, only 300. Syria, only 146. Iran, which we would think of as a totalitarian regime, only 100. The USA, only 50. And the lowest, Hungary, only 10. And so this British phrase in their legislation is grossly offensive. The new one in Canada under Bill C9 is willfully promoting hatred. But the real problem is that both of these are so elastic to depend solely on the complainant's feelings. And in effect, what is happening under Bill C9 is the state is outsourcing its standards to the most sensitive and malevolent people in our society, and they're empowering activists and state-appointed bureaucrats to wield the criminal law as a bludgeon against dissidents. And J.D. Vance noticed this earlier this year when he was at he was in Munich, and he was talking to European elites. And he said very pointedly, and they were sort of squirming in their seats. And he said, the biggest threat to freedom in Europe is not Mr. Putin and Russia; it's you guys, because what you're doing is all of you are suppressing speech under the guise of safety. You claim to be fighting disinformation, but in reality, you're just suppressing opposition. You claim to defend minorities, but actually you're just silencing them. And so this claim to defend democracy in Europe is bogus, and they got called out on it. And I think what emerges here is a selective enforcement regime in which the elites are going to be exempt and ordinary citizens are going to be vulnerable. So for example, a tweet from a farmer in Cold Lake, Alberta, will be treated as criminal, while a prime minister can brand everyone in his country. Did this actually happen? A prime minister could brand everybody who won't take an experimental drug, a radical, an extremist, but can do so with impunity. And so that's kind of an overview, 10,000-foot view of what these laws are doing. But underneath of all of this is a deep cultural drift. So Bill C-9 and these other laws are not just bad law, they're bad philosophy. They're modern governments like what we have in Ottawa have come to glorify emotion, to elevate feelings over objective truth, because emotions swing elections. We saw that recently in April, the whole elbows up thing. That's what won the election for them. And this is a really serious problem. But I think at the root of it is a cultural drift that we're seeing in Canada and really throughout the West. So that's kind of a general overview. So I'll throw it back to you, Payman, for discussion. I've been talking a long time here. Hopefully everybody's still awake.
Just a topical, uplifting Saturday conversation about the state of Canada.
Yeah, it's not good news. It's not good news. I'm sorry. I wish it could be, but
I'm gonna hand control over to Andre. I'm sure he's got a bunch of questions, but before I do, for the people watching, because this is a controversial topic in Canada, I wouldn't be surprised if they're deboosting this. So please, if you could share the stream, that would help get our audience count up. Go ahead, Andre.
Well, that was a long introduction that practically summarized everything. Thank you a lot, Leighton, first of all, for being here. You're a lawyer, and I have many questions, but there's one question that puzzles me. During the COVID mandate and with the rise of the Freedom Convoy, there were not a lot of doctors who opposed the injection, mandatory injection, or well, like you mentioned, how to be able to paint dissidents, and there were not a lot of lawyers who stood up with people who were trying to defend their rights. And we see what happened with Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. As a lawyer, do you see an uprising in the consciousness of Canadian people? I'm in Quebec. I don't see it. Maybe I don't know. You were talking about totalitarianism. Anna Arendt, in her book, she refers to a period that is very short in time. Are we facing months of totalitarianism or years before people wake up? As a lawyer, how do you perceive this?
Well, it's a great question. It's one I've asked many times, but if you look historically, in Nazi Germany, doctors, in terms of their per capita percentage of the population, they were the highest concentration of Nazi party members. Okay, they were followed closely by lawyers. So this is not a good demographic. But unfortunately, part of the reason why that is, and of course academics and other people, quote unquote experts, the intelligentsia, the people who see themselves as elites, they tend to follow the trend of power. And of course they have a vested interest. I shouldn't say they, because I'm part of the legal profession, but I'd say as a general rule, they follow where the power goes because that's where the opportunity is. And of course, the cost of dissension is so high. In Nazi Germany, it meant death. In Canada, it looks like it's going to mean imprisonment. I mentioned Bill C-9. Maximum penalty under Bill C-9 is life imprisonment, the same as murder. So the cost of speaking out what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the cost of discipleship, is getting very, very high in Canada. And of course, the real danger behind this, and the one that we've got to face, is that when this happens, it's important to sort of talk about what is the function of speech. What is the function of speech in our society? John Milton wrote a famous tract called Areopagitica in 1651 that gives you an idea of how old this problem is. It's not new. There's nothing new under the sun here, folks. Governments have been trying to suppress speech and dissent for a really long time. We've had this push and pull throughout history, and sometimes we've had revolutions over it. But the real point of speech, the reason why free speech is vital, and really our laws that protect free speech are only necessary to protect offensive speech. It's redundant. We don't need to protect speech that doesn't offend. If I compliment Payman Asghari on the start of his program, he doesn't need protected from that. But if I call him a skunk and a scoundrel, then that's going to offend him. But we need to have that debate. I've got to maybe have a chance to prove my point. And this is the function of speech, and this is really important for people to understand. This concept that speech is violence is a leftist concept. It comes out of the French Revolution. And it's found really its apex in the Charlie Kirk assassination, because that young man who shot Charlie Kirk was saying that if you say something that offends me, I can stop your speech with a bullet. Getting back to my Chesterton comment, the thought that stops thought. With the purpose of speech, however, in the Western culture, is very unique, and the purpose of it is it's a truth-based inquiry. So in legal context, we go to court. We have the adversarial system. In the scientific concept, in the scientific milieu, what you have is the scientific method, the point counterpoint. It's the same idea, though. These are truth-seeking endeavors. The same is true in medicine, engineering, all aspects of inquiry. But when we get into the concept of debate, let's say in a legal or political context, the importance of speech is really heightened, because if we have free speech, it actually is the best method that we have found for preventing violence. And so we have to permit offensive speech. And I'm not saying that we should protect all speech. Certainly there are some types that we can all agree. For example, ones that actually incite people to violence and hatred. The classic example would be, screaming fire in a movie theater. But the purpose of speech really is to permit us to solve problems peacefully. And it really isn't possible to do that unless you can risk offending someone. In fact, I don't think you can have a meaningful conversation about anything if you have to be constantly worried about offending somebody else. And of course, this right not to be offended has never been protected in our law. And so this is the new innovation, and this is why it's so dangerous, because it's going to draw us to violence. It's going to make us a more violent society, a less peaceful society. And that might be part of the reason why our government doesn't want us to have any guns. That may be a very good explanation for why totalitarian regimes, for example, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Russia, the Cubans, the Chinese, all were involved in gun confiscation. It's a hallmark of a totalitarian regime. But when you suppress speech, you heighten violence. But then you have a situation where you have a government that has a monopoly on coercion. And then, of course, if they're the only ones who have weapons, we know how this is going to go. But what we're talking about here with speech is another example of trying to restructure a society such as Canada or Great Britain or the United States or Australia, where the people were placed in a position where they hold the political power. And what's really happening right now, and a lot of the laws that we're seeing passed not only in Canada but in other parts of the West, are really aimed at changing that, creating this top-down type of society, which we haven't really had in Canada, at least not in recent history. And so what you're getting at is really important. But the doctors and lawyers are part of this power structure, or they see themselves as such. But if they understand history, they're not going to like things very much in the moment after all the lights go out and the last vestiges of a free and democratic society leave. Because if you look at history, these people who think that they're elites, oftentimes they're the first ones to go when when the violence, the really serious political violence, actually starts.
Well, it's interesting. You're mentioning the doctors and lawyers were close to power. I have two short questions. I will hand it to Tim after. The first one, he said, you were mentioning the premier of province who are not opposing. I'm from Quebec. We lived curfew just before Christmas. I'm Christian. Just before Christmas, I could not even have my family to celebrate Christmas, and we had a curfew for 4 months, 2 times. So we're quite a little bit ahead of English Canadian in Quebec. Sadly,
Yes.
my first question is toward the MP, the Prime Minister of provinces. They do not oppose. Do you see an opposition in Canada outside of alternative media today? Do you see something that could help us fight this tendency of authoritarianism, if not totalitarianism?
Yeah. This is a really great question. The short answer is yes. But I don't think that it's not going to come from the political class, unfortunately. I'm glad that you mentioned Quebec, because if you understand the history of Quebec, and I'm not a Quebecer, but I have studied the history of Quebec. You see really in Quebec is a vital part of Canada. And in fact, when things are good in Quebec, things tend to be good in the rest of Canada. And so in Quebec, when Quebec had a Catholic culture, it was a very vibrant part of Canada. It produced a lot of great literature, great music, great politicians, great diplomats, great sportsmen. And it had a very important cultural contribution to Canada. In fact, you cannot really imagine Canada without Quebec. What I see in Quebec, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. In the era from after the René Lévesque and the Parti Québécois, and the secularization of Quebec, to the point where Christian missionaries are being sent to Quebec, and to visit universities, and they talk to young people in universities in Montreal who've never even heard about the gospel. They've never been taught anything about Jesus Christ or the Bible. It's hard to imagine, in Maurice Duplessis, Quebec, that would have been the case. And so I think the secularization of Quebec is a very important part of what's happening to the rest of Canada, because we're not grounded the way Quebec was arguably the most Christian part of Canada. And that's not true anymore. Now, I think you could make the argument that it's maybe the most secular part of Canada. And where I live, out in the West in Alberta, we've sort of taken over the mantle of the most Christian and conservative, and hence, we're resisting all of this. But the question of how and why this is going to change is a really important question. And I'm going to sort of put a little bit of sunlight on all the gloom I've been painting. Again, I'm going to turn to Chesterton. Chesterton wrote a great book 100 years ago called The Everlasting Man. I'd really recommend it to anybody who is interested in Christian theology and understanding its application to the rest of society, especially modern society. And he talked about Christianity going through a series of deaths over time. And it's been considered dead many times. Nietzsche wrote a couple of years ago, God is dead. But it always comes back. It has a series of revivals. And Chesterton said that's grounded in the fact that our Savior rose from the dead and is unique in that. And so I think what's happening now globally, and maybe it hasn't hit Canada fully yet, but I think you can see the seeds of this starting to take bloom in the United States, where you see major political figures talking about God, talking about faith, quoting scripture. Donald Trump was talking about the attack on Christianity from someplace called the Museum of the Bible, which I'm ashamed to say I didn't even know existed. I have to visit there. But he said the same thing in the UN. He said, there's an attack on Christianity. He's going to do something about it. J.D. Vance led a prayer meeting when he hosted Charlie Kirk's podcast. Pete Hegseth quoted scripture during a press conference as the Secretary of War. So we're seeing this, and of course everybody watched. Most people, many millions, watched the prayer vigil for that was for Charlie Kirk in Arizona, and every speaker was getting up and talking about Christianity and faith and the Bible. That hasn't hit Canada. In Canada, for some reason, none of our political class wants to even touch this. In fact, one of our conservative MPs, she made a speech in the House of Commons, and this is in the context of them presenting their, their motion for a moment of silence for Charlie Kirk, which the Liberals disgustingly opposed. But she talked about Charlie Kirk's assassination in the context of an assault on free speech. And although that's true, that's like describing the crucifixion of Jesus Christ as a political murder. That's true, but you're kind of missing the point. And I think where this is going to change is when we get a grassroots movement of Christians in Canada. Because MAGA, you have to understand, is a lot of people don't understand this. They think it's Donald Trump out in front with a baton and everybody's just marching this parade. But I think MAGA, properly understood, is like a wave, and people like Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump are actually on a surfboard surfing that wave. It's a grassroots movement, but it's making its way throughout the world. If you look at what's happening in Italy, if you look at what's happening in places like Hungary and Poland, where a lot of this new religion that I talked about, that Mark Carney wants to impose in Canada, is being rejected roundly. And I think it's in its death throes in Britain too, if you see what's happening there. But I think there is going to be, my prediction is that there is going to be a grassroots Christian movement in Canada. And when that starts to I think it's already taken root. We're not seeing the full manifestations of it, but we're seeing examples. We're seeing in sort of dribs and drabs. We're seeing it, but once that reaches the political class, and I think we're going to see at a certain point, in the not too distant future, when Canadian politicians are going to start talking openly about God and faith and the Bible in their public discourse, that's when things are really going to change. That is going to be the tipping point when Christianity is once again going to, is going to restore some sense of order in the chaos that's been created by what we call wokeness, which is really a cult that is a very jealous cult that's trying to supplant the place that the Judeo-Christian values and morality have held in our society. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think change is coming. And I think we're going to start to see more of the signs of it. I think what Canada needs, and I don't know what quarter this is going to come from, but I believe it is going to happen in Canada eventually, is Canada needs a leader like a Javier Milei or a Meloni in Italy, or Donald Trump for that matter, who's going to come from outside of the political class, outside of the political machine. And it's going to have a whole different agenda. And I think many Canadians, a growing number of Canadians, are sick of all this stuff. They're tired of it, but they don't see an alternative. The Conservative Party of Canada, my respectful opinion, doesn't offer a realistic option to the Liberals. The Conservatives, much like the Conservatives in Great Britain, are really small L Liberals. They're not really Conservatives. If they were, then they would be talking about the types of things that the Conservatives in the United States are talking about in terms of the Trump and MAGA movement.
Good. I will. You talk about secular province. I've seen some manifestation of, I would say, faith renewal in Quebec. I'm surprised, but I think it goes with what you're saying.
I'm so glad you told me that.
I'm seeing it, but it's just starting, but I feel it. So I will hand the microphone to Tim. I'm sure he's eager to ask you a question.
Well, thanks for your great questions. I appreciate it.
There is so much to ask. First, I want to thank the audience and remind you that the more views we have, the more views we get. So please like, share, subscribe, do all the things, and push it out to your audiences for us, please. And particularly because we're a young podcast, and when we get people on like Leighton Grey, we kind of get all excited and wiggle in our seat and don't really know what to do with ourselves. So I've been furiously taking notes for half of an hour. And so when they turn my mic off, I have to do something, right? So I can't interrupt anybody. All I hear is Ministry of Truth. All I hear is Orwellian, right? All I hear is them in the novel. They brag about reducing the number of words that will be in the next edition of the dictionary.
Yep.
We're watching this happen. The manipulation of language, where we've talked about this on our show, and a lot of others have noticed this as well. Years ago, the left begins using language in a slightly modified manner. And so we on the right, we sit there going, that's not quite what Oxford says, but I'm interested in dialogue. So we'll step into your universe and we'll have conversation, because dialogue and the rules of discussion will root out what they mean by this word and come to the truth of the matter. And, you know, like a bunch of altruistic dummies, we think that they're going to play fair on those rules, and they don't.
Yeah.
And they push and we give a little ground, and they push and we give a little ground, until we're at a place where they could literally write laws that are 100% garbage.
Yeah.
And the average citizen who reads them reads something else entirely.
Yeah.
And that's by design. And it takes years, like we're saying, it's taken at least since 2015 to move to that position. So the question becomes, how do we fight? Is not the right word, but it is the right word, right?
Sure.
How do we resist? How do we resist? How do we resist that?
Yeah.
Right?
This is a great question. It's a great question. I've asked myself many times. I'm glad that you brought up Orwell. Of course, Orwell is maybe the most overquoted book. Now, I don't mean to criticize you, because it's not trite. It's just so relevant. I saw a meme recently somebody did with AI that was just brilliant. It had George Orwell speaking, and he was approached by a Bobby, a British policeman, who asked him for his digital ID. And Orwell starts to chuckle. He says, don't you know I was only kidding about that? But in the novel, in the book 1984, there's a character signed. He's the Newspeak lexicographer, which is the person who basically defines speech. And he says this. He says, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible, because there will be no words in which to express it. And just to give you a tangible example of where this goes, in the North Korean language, there's no word for escape. There's no word for escape in the North Korean language. Hence, if people want to ask the question, why aren't more people trying to get out of North Korea? Well, they're not just afraid. They can't form the thought to escape, because that concept has been taken out of their language. And this is how important language is. But to answer your question, this is something that is very important. And I think we have to start to exercise something that I'm calling semantic vigilance. What I mean by that is we got to take back the words. What you were saying was quite right. On the one hand, those of us, if we can, on our side of the debate, let's call ourselves, small c conservatives. We understand that the English language evolves. It's an organic thing. It evolves with our culture. It evolves with our technology, and the language has to evolve. I mean, could you imagine if we were sitting having this conversation in, 16th century? We sounded like, the King James Bible. I get accused sometimes, by the way. My wife says sometimes it sounds like you're reading out of a book when you're talking. That's not a compliment. But anyway, there's a few suggestions here. One is, become the lexicographer of your own mind. In other words, pay attention to the words you use and the ones used by people around you. Look up definitions. Get interested in this stuff. It's important. Understand the etymology, the history, the way words develop. And it's really important. A richer vocabulary means a richer internal world and an enhanced capacity for precise thought and expression. So I say to people, really, take charge of your own language. The second thing is, and you raised a really good point here, where we sort of let the left take over and redefine words like gender and what is a woman. We really need to challenge this. We challenge euphemism and jargon. So when you encounter language that's designed to be obscure, politely but firmly seek clarification. Demand plain speech, especially from people in power. I was listening to Mark Carney speak today, and I didn't think it was possible for somebody to be less coherent than Justin Trudeau, but I think Mark Carney has surpassed him. I think he's the gold medalist, but I think it's by design. But we don't have to permit ambiguous terms like disinformation, misinformation, hate speech. We don't have to let them pass without comment. We can question them, and we really must. Here's another one. Discover diverse linguistic perspectives. So read a lot. This is something, and engage with literature. We've talked about a series of books during this conversation. You brought up 1984. Engage with literature and philosophy and journalism from diverse cultural and ideological viewpoints. This is very important because it broadens the understanding of how language can be used and abused. So if you don't read all this, all this postmodernist mumbo jumbo, if you don't actually look at the wording of these laws, you're not exposed to alternative frames of reference, and it's really important that we do so. Here's another one. Practice nuanced communication. So in your own interactions, strive for clarity. Try to be as precise in your speech, but do it with empathy. Avoid hyperbole and exaggeration or simplistic binaries. Try to engage in constructive debate where the goal is mutual understanding rather than rhetorical victory. I'll give an example from my own life. I have a wonderful young man working in my office who's a lawyer, and he's Muslim. And we had a conversation about the Charlie Kirk assassination. And this young man, who's my friend, I love him. He's like my brother. He said, "Rest in piss," describing Charlie Kirk. And I asked him why. He said, "Well, because Charlie Kirk said all these offensive things about Muslim people." And I said, "Well, gee, rest in piss. Can you see how that might be offensive to Christians?" And so we can have these conversations. But I didn't get mad at him. I didn't call him a bigot or anything like that. I just said, "Look, you're using this language. You're using this really strong rhetoric. Is it accurate? Is it precise?" So you can have a conversation like that. At least we still can for now in Canada. Here's the most important one. Defend what you think and you believe is right. And don't be afraid to say unpopular things. And again, coming back to the Charlie Kirk assassination, the importance of communicating uncomfortable truths has never been more important in our country, in our world. Freedom of speech is meaningless without the freedom to think, which is really what governments are trying to deny through bills like C9. That's really what George Orwell was writing about in 1984. And that freedom really relies upon the availability of robust, unsullied language. We have to be able to use words that might offend other people. And another thing we have to do is we have to protect spaces where unconventional or challenging ideas can be expressed without immediate linguistic condemnation or definition. So again, that's getting at, for example, Bill C8, which was trying to take a forum like this away from us, so that I can't have this kind of conversation with you gentlemen that's shared with many other people. These tools I'm talking about, they're not just intellectual exercises. I think they're acts of peaceful resistance against these forces that are trying to shape our minds by controlling our words. And these are pathways to strengthening our individual and collective intellectual immune systems. There's a Canadian author named God Sod, you're probably familiar with, that talks about idea pathogens. He wrote a great book about this. And when we use speech accurately and precisely, and we speak truth, we sort of immunize our minds against these pathological lies that distort truth by manipulating our language and change the way that we communicate each other. In that book that you mentioned, 1984, Orwell has what he calls his last lesson. And this is a perpetual call to arms for anyone who values independent thought and genuine human connection. And what he means by that is that there's a battleground over language, and it operates on so many different levels, all the way down from the individual all the way up to the top levels of society, and the battleground is over words. Words in our tradition, in the Western tradition, are vitally important. Going back to the Bible, at the very beginning of Genesis, we have an omnipotent God who creates the universe through speech. The Lord spoke the light. He spoke light into existence. He created man. Let there be light. He created us in his image through words. In the book of John in the New Testament, it says that Christ was the Word made flesh. The Word made flesh, right? So there's a connection between a deep cultural and spiritual connection between words and truth. And remember, just again, talking about Jesus Christ, what did he use to communicate with us? Words, right? Jesus did not leave behind all sorts of writings. He wasn't that. That's not what he did. He went out into public spaces, into private spaces, and he spoke truth, and he used words as a means of communication. And in our society, what we found is that's the greatest recipe for peace. That's the greatest recipe for freedom. That's the greatest way that we can produce prosperity. Think of what type of innovation or technological advances we could possibly have in a society where speech is restricted. It's impossible. And so what I want to get across to the folks who are listening in is, this whole concept of restriction of speech operates on many different levels, and it goes all the way down to the roots of the way we see ourselves, the way that we relate to each other. And freedom of speech is absolutely essential to any concept of human flourishing. In every single society where governments have been successful in suppressing and censoring speech, you've had misery, starvation, genocide, and death. It's just you could draw a straight line. There simply are no exceptions.
I'm reminded of when I was a kid in the 80s, and every now and then some tree-hugging National Geographic explorer would find a tribe down in Central America or some deep, dark African jungle out in or New Guinea, whatever, and say, we found these new people. They are archaic and untouched. They're prehistoric. Their language is so pure, they don't even have a word for war. Remember that, right? That was a trope, right? That went along with the whole Green Day, the Earth, with all of that. The early push of Marxism in a pretty little hug a tree package in the 80s. And I get the feeling, watching the progression that's happening to our language, this Orwellian implosion of our cultural heritage, the aliens will find us 100 years from now and say, look at these quaint, archaic people. They don't have a word for freedom.
Yeah.
Right. And
that's something.
Right. So you've mentioned the spiritual element, and regardless of whether somebody is a person of any particular faith or not, there are things that we cannot see and cannot measure that do indeed exist and have effect.
Right.
You cannot measure love, except you can. You cannot measure hate, except you can. You cannot, etc. So my thought here, writing as you're talking, is language is a toolkit for relationships, a spiritual exchange. Yes. Relationships are a spiritual exchange, because I can speak to you and your insides warm up, like literally, physically, right? Physically warm up. I can, they say warms my heart, and they're literally, right? So we can do this with words. We can cause people, this is why horror movies are so great. It's because people have these very fast moving waves of emotion, right? And this,
right.
So, right, why love stories are so important to a culture, because they remind you through all the stuff, there's still the good things, right? And so, and language provides this. eventually, if we continue without resisting, and by resisting, I'm directly referring to Martin Luther King Jr. civil disobedience.
Right.
Canada is not there yet. It must go there.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that means that I'm now guilty of incitement.
Yeah.
Right.
What I would say is what we've got to do is we have to be willing to pay what I call the cost of discipleship. In other words, we have to be able to stick. You have to be willing to stick our necks out. Shameless plug. You can see my book here. I'll just tell you. You know, the cover. It depicts Sir Thomas More, who was sainted by the Catholic Church. And if people want to know the story, there's a play that was made into a movie in the 1960s called A Man for All Seasons. You gentlemen might have seen this. It stars Robert Shaw and a host of other really brilliant English actors. But it tells the story of one of the stories of Henry VIII, who was sort of this mercurial character, a real titan of English history. But in the early 16th century, he decided that he was going to break away from the church in Rome and start his own church. And he had various reasons for that. Some people think it was because he wanted a divorce. Some people think it was because he wanted to be able to own all these papal states and have the taxes for England so he could wage war on other countries in Europe. Whatever the reasons were, he decided to break from Rome. Well, the person who was his essential prime minister, the first chancellor, was Thomas More, who was a brilliant man, a legal scholar. He wrote a famous tract called Utopia, which is very misquoted in society. The word actually means no place, by the way. But Thomas More was a devout Christian, and so he was placed in a dilemma. He had to decide whether he was going to be loyal to his faith, which he saw as being connected to the church in Rome, or to his king. And he knew that he had enemies in the realm who wanted him out of the way because he was a close friend of the king. And the king had a very, very difficult dilemma. He was, he wasn't. He was prone to killing his own wives. So he normally didn't have any trouble sentencing someone to death, but he really struggled over Thomas More, and he put him in jail for a long period of time and starved him and put all kinds of pressure on him to break him because he knew how important he was and how beloved he was in England. But in the end, Thomas More was taken off and he was executed. And so the cover of my book depicts him being carried off to lose his head. He chose his God. He chose his faith, what he believed to be right. He chose the truth over his own head. And that type of faith, that type of conviction, that type of love of truth is extraordinary. This is an extraordinary example. We have more recent examples. I would say someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You might include someone like Reverend Martin Luther King. You might include someone like Charlie Kirk now, who knew the risks that he was taking, and really what he was doing is he was bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to young people. He said himself that was essentially what he was doing. But I think in Canada, what we need to do is we have to look at these examples in history. We have to understand the moment that we're in, a dangerous moment. And we have to be willing to pay this cost of discipleship in our own lives. So what does this mean? I think, first of all, we've got to speak. We've got to speak loudly. We've got to speak fearlessly, even when silence is safer. And I would say especially then. And we have to build new platforms. If StreamYard or X are taken away, then we have to gather in other places where truth is not choked out by mob rule. And we have to remind the world that a free people are not measured by their obedience to unjust laws, but by their courage to challenge tyranny. And above all, we have to declare with unshakable resolve that truth is not fragile. It does not need state protection. And we have to tell our governments this. The truth only needs proclamation, but we have to have the courage and the conviction to state it and to stand by it the way Thomas More was. And unfortunately, we don't yet have enough people in our political class in Canada who are willing to do that. We have a lot of pragmatic politicians who are very interested in power, and what they're doing is they're saying to us, oh well, if we just could get into power, we could do all these really great things. But I think what Canadians need to see is the type of leadership which says to us that, look, this is the kind of person I am, this is the kind of character I am, and this is and that we can get behind you because you tell us the truth, you speak truth. And we don't have that in our political class yet. But I agree with what Andre said. I'm seeing the signs of it in our culture, especially in our young people. Charlie Kirk said that in the United States that the people between the ages of 18 and 35 are the most conservative demographic in the United States in over 50 years. And I suspect that that is largely true of Canada as well. But of course, this begs this. Then you begin to understand why censorship is important. Well, if we can take away the words, if we can punish dissent in our country, then that's going to kill the momentum that's coming. And I think this sort of answers the overall question. If people are asking, well, why that I posed off the top of the show, why is this government, which is faced with so many serious problems? Some people are describing Canada as going over a cliff economically. Why are they so interested? Why are they placing so much importance on suppression, restriction, and punishment of speech? And I think it's because they see what's coming. They see what's going on in the United States. They see what's happening elsewhere, and they know that a change is coming. It's been more acute and more obvious, I think, since the Charlie Kirk assassination a month ago. But I'm convinced that globalism has actually had its day, and that the sun is going down on these guys, and this is why they're racing against a ticking clock. And that's why they think if they can get all these laws in place, that it'll keep them in power. But I just don't see how these lies are going to be sustained, are going to silence truth. I have a great confidence in the Canadian people, and I think that more and more people are rejecting this stuff, and we're not hearing about it enough because, of course, the control that's exercised through our media. But if they weren't afraid, if they didn't see the need for these bills and these laws, then they wouldn't be trying to pass them. And so, in a strange sense, I see these laws almost as a sign that something is rising in the soul of Canada. And that this government, which I regard as practically and metaphysically and evil, I think we have an evil federal government. I think we have a malicious federal government that's actually aiming at hurting Canadians. That does not act in our best interests. I think this is palpably true. I could, if I talk for hours, I could not cite all the examples of this. If this is true, there's so much evidence; it's overwhelming. But I don't think that it's sustainable, and I would say to the people who are listening, I have great confidence that the change is coming. But it's got to happen at a grassroots level. It's got to happen at the personal level, at the family level, in our businesses, in our places of work. But we have to continue to speak and to call out lies and to speak truth.
Yeah, I think a note that Canada has not responded to the Charlie Kirk assassination, which in my mind is reasonably analogous to JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. It's reasonably analogous to the mid-60s, and that the spirit of dissent among the people in that era. I think the reason why it hasn't cottoned on, like grabbed as much energy in Canada, is because Canada does not assassinate its dissidents.
Right.
We drag them through the court until they're destitute, right?
Yeah.
Right. So because they learned after Louis Riel, we probably shouldn't hang a hero, right? And they learned after the 1905, the Winnipeg General Strike, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a conservative party in power that went in and did those things to the strikers. And so they learn after that. And then they step into, you move forward 100 years to we'll watch what happened with the convoy. The paralysis that the House felt, right, when those 50,000 people descended in, the center of Ottawa, that wasn't that. There were voices in there that said, we want heads to roll. There were people who wanted to embed the military into RCMP uniforms and put them out on the streets. And but the government wisely chose not to do that. Canada does not have martyrs. We don't have people who die. The closest you get is Arthur Pawlowski being dropped into a dark prison somewhere in northern Alberta, whatever. But who's going to read his book, right? And that's the problem, is exposure. Who's going to believe that, right? And my generation, Gen X, once upon a time, I used to blame the millennials for everything. And then I realized, wait a minute, all my children are millennials, right? And they're pretty good. They're well adjusted. They have their stuff, but they're making their way, and all their friends are reasonably good, and etc. So maybe it's me, right? And then I realized, if I think a millennial or did a bad thing, then maybe I should look at the parent who created the conditions in which that could happen. Then I realized that in the 80s, when we were all screaming with Beastie Boys, we're not going to take it. Well, we have in fact taken it, right? And we have bent. And Gen X in white collar positions, business owners, frontline professionals, etc., bureaucrats, in that layer of administration. During COVID, they had an opportunity to say, you know what, I know BS when I see it.
Yeah,
I'm going to say something, and they did not.
Right.
And they did
by and
not.
large, that's true.
By and large, it's true. There are those who did, but even for them, and those who are a little more academic will see signs, right? They'll see the curve starting on the road. And I need to make sure that's an actual curve, because when I open my mouth, that's my reputation, right? So I think that a lot of the white collar and a lot of frontliners, when March 2020 hit, and the first lockdown, and they went, okay, we'll wait and see how this works. And then 2 weeks goes by, and they're like, yeah, I don't quite think I have enough evidence yet. And then it becomes 3 months. And by that time, they're completely invested, because they've been playing along to gain access to that information.
Right.
And then, like you said, too much invested. A doctor with, millions of dollars in debt and a staff of 15, et cetera, right? He can't do it. He just can't do it. The businessman who's at risk of CRA coming after him for the most minute thing and losing his business, it's just too much. So you mentioned that there's a turn, and I think the turn is not going to be found in Gen X. It's going to be found in the millennials and the Gen Zs. And when I talk to young people out there at the coffee shops and the grocery stores and et cetera, they're savvy, they're clever, they are on the ball. And it's interesting, because you look at history, and it is always the people under or near 30-ish years of age, the Alexanders, right? The Caesars. It's the young who do it. It's the young who do it. And I think, as far as pundits like ourselves and movers like yourself, there's an opportunity for us to include more youth into the conversation.
Absolutely.
And I think
it's I would say it's an imperative. It's more than an opportunity. It's an imperative. But I think you're very right. It's the youth that will move culture. And one of the promising, and this is going to sound weird, one of the promising things about Canada right now is that being pro-freedom, being Christian, is called counterculture. And youth historically is always counterculture. They will always go against the ideology of their parents. You go back to the 1950s and Elvis Presley and rock and roll. That was a rebellion against a very buttoned down society. You go back further to the Victorian era, was a reaction to an era in English society in the latter part of the 18th century, early part of the 19th century, which was very much like what we're living through right now. Okay. And so, but you're right, it is in the youth. They always go, they'll always go for the counterculture. And Charlie Kirk is a representation of that. What he was doing, going into those universities, This is horrifying to think, but going into universities and talking about free speech and liberty and faith, that's counterculture. That's counter to the culture that's in those universities. And the university is one of the examples of our sort of grounding institutions, one of the pillars of Western culture. So I agree with you about that. I see what you're saying about, people in my generation, for example, being hesitant to speak out. I'm not as generous to them as you are. I spoke out. I was canceled. I'm on Bernie Farber's anti-hate list. I'm probably one of the people who's going to be targeted by Bill C9. And it has cost me, but it cost me in some ways. But it's also blessed me in ways that I could not even imagine. I wouldn't have met Payman if I would have kept my mouth shut. Dr. Roger Hodkinson, who has been a very outspoken, proponent of truth in medicine. He's had his license revoked and his career completely destroyed. And he's 81 years old. We're part of a GoFundMe program for him right now. And there are other examples of very prominent people who spoke out at great cost. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya is another one who fortunately landed on his feet. He's got a really good job right now, but he didn't know that at the time. Back in 2020, when he with two other esteemed scientists, created something called the Great Barrington Declaration. He didn't know what that was going to mean. He was risking, a lifetime of reputation built up at Stanford and an elite university. So I think that those of us who are, let's say, Gen Xers, we still have to be good examples to younger people. They still have to be able to look to older people who are willing to pay a cost. I think that's an important part of it. I'm grateful that I was given the opportunity to do that. I think I was called to do it. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to be arrested. I don't want the Law Society to take away my ability to practice law, but I'm not going to cease speaking truth in order to protect myself from those risks. I try to be very careful about what I say and measured in my comments, but at the same time, I'm not willing to cow to these people, to these tyrants. So I'm going to continue to speak truth for as long as I possibly can. And it's becoming more dangerous in our country to do that. But I don't see any other course of action. I think if I can't be an example to my sons, who are like your kids, who are millennials, then what good am I? I'm part of the problem. I'm not part of the solution. And I have to walk my talk. That's why I'm doing the podcast. That's why I'm here with you, talking to you nice people, and hopefully reaching many people out there. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. I don't need to do this. I could stop talking about this and just go back to practicing law and make a lot more money. And the government will be quite pleased if I did that, I'm sure. I could take out a membership in the Liberal Party of Canada. Although I'd probably cut off my left arm first. In fact, I'd chew it off first. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to continue to be here and speak truth in this space. And that's the obligation that I think people like me have, because we have a voice, we have a platform, and we can reach people and tell them about the truth. Because if we stop doing that, then that's when they win. That's when they take over the words. That's when they take over the lexicon. And I just can't let that happen. And I know that I'm sure that all of you feel the same way.
You can unmute yourself, Payman. Go ahead.
The keyboard's not working. I got all sorts of technical issues here. I'm not going to bother anyone. Tim, I take it you're content with the questions you asked. They were answered sufficiently.
So you're asking me if I'm content?
Would you like to grade Mr. Leighton Gray's responses?
I'm on the eighth day, God said this was good.
I I usually don't get these references. I'm sort of the young, not that young, but I'm a younger one on this panel. So I'm sure you're going to have to explain that one to me later too. Andre, are you content? Do you have any other follow-up questions, or we can?
Maybe I just have one quick question. You mentioned something, Leighton, and you come here on the podcast, you have your podcast, and we generally agree on many topics. How come we cannot invite people? I will not say from the left, but for people who are following the agenda. This is maybe what frightens me the most.
Yeah.
That we cannot have a debate with those people. And when I say those, I will put quote unquote, because I do not want to judge people. Is it possible today with the alternative media to invite people who would come and debate and use the logos? We use this expression often. Is it possible, or are we in sort of some echo chamber?
What a great question. And this is one that I ask myself all the time. I can tell you, I send out more invitations to people, let's say on the other side of the debate, than I do to anyone else to come on to my program. But the fundamental problem is the people who are on the other side of these questions that we talk about, let's call them the left or liberals or whatever, they don't place the same value on debate that we do. And in fact, they are astonishingly ignorant of our ideas and what we think. And this is something that we forget. You talk about echo chamber. Most of the people who call themselves conservatives, who are working in this space, they're very familiar. We've talked about a lot of leftist ideas here on this program. We're very familiar with their stuff. And we're pretty equipped to take it apart because we're familiar with it. They know nothing about our side of the debate. In fact, that's one of the characteristics of the left, is it wallows in its own ignorance. It's just like a pig spinning in mud. It doesn't want to get clean. It doesn't want to find out about the possibility that whether or not it could be clean. And that's part of the problem. When you invite them, they don't want to come because they regard everything that we say as hate speech. They categorize it as hate speech. And when I listen to some of the things that people say on the left, very little of it I would describe as hate speech. I'll give you an example. There's a member of a cabinet minister in Manitoba who said some really disgraceful, disgusting things about Charlie Kirk in the wake of his assassination. And of course, Premier Canoe got up and he defended her. But I didn't regard anything that she wrote as hate speech. I found it was offensive to my sensibilities, but I would not ban her from saying any of that. I don't think that she should be jailed for any of that. But the picture on the other side, on the left, is very, very different. They not only want to halt our speech, what they've demonstrated with Charlie Kirk is they want to kill us. Well, how are we going to have a debate with people who want to kill us or are willing to kill us to shut us up? That's a really serious problem. The other problem is, a debate. Let's take the example of lawyers, okay, or parliamentarians in the House of Commons. In order to have a debate, you've got to have some set of rules that people are going to play by. And unfortunately, the people who are on the other side of the debate are not willing to follow those rules. They're not willing to respect us enough to listen to what we say. I believe there's a quotation that's attributed to Voltaire, which says that I may disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And those of us on our side of the debate, we really value that, and we for the most part we walk that out. But the people who we want to have these meaningful debates with, they're really not willing to debate with us, and that's why they want to censor us. They have to take control of the language and silence us because I think part of the reason is I would say their ideas are bad. They don't hold up to debate very well. but I think it's just innate in their position that they have to have sole power over the use and application of language. They don't want to have a situation where they could possibly be in a conversation where they could be made to look silly or absurd or be mocked. And that's, Hannah Arendt talked about this in her writings. One of the useful means of standing up to totalitarianism is mockery. And of course, this is what memes do on social media, for example. When you get a picture of Justin Trudeau and dressed up as Hitler, it makes a certain point, right? But they can't withstand that. That has to be prohibited speech. And so I think these are some of the problems and some of the reasons why. Now, having said all that, we still have to keep trying. We still have to keep trying to restore some order to that public space. We have to keep trying to engage with them. This is what Charlie Kirk did, right? He went to universities, and you can see so often. I've been watching. I don't know about you, but watching a lot of these engagements that he had with students, and it's remarkable to see how kind he was. He always would go after, attack, what they were saying, but not them personally. And sometimes you see these young kids; they'll actually flip right before your very eyes. They're like, "Oh my God, I didn't know that what I was thinking was really silly." And I think that's that kind of benevolent approach, being hard on the problem and soft on the people. That's an approach that we on our side have to continue to have, because the Lord says we have to love our neighbor. We even have to pray for our enemies. So we can't very well go out and debate and try and massacre them. So we can't respond in kind. I think we have to keep inviting them to the conversation, because that's the only way we're going to get back to a space where we can actually have peaceful conversations with them. Of course, they're trying to destroy those conversations. That's kind of the essence of these bills. But that doesn't mean, I think that just puts on us a greater onus to try and restore this public space where we can have these debates.
You remarked about the rules of engagement, and I'm reminded of the marriage counselor, right? So you have a husband and a wife who are completely ready to just walk away from each other, but they agree to the terms that of a counseling session or a series of sessions to sit down, and they agree to these terms. The first thing the counselor does is throw them in the crucible and make them both angry with each other. And he does it on purpose. He inflames them immediately in the crucible to get the dross to the top. Like you had said regarding Charlie Kirk and some of his people, in the heat of that moment, they became separated from the concepts to which they had become tied by an ideological umbilical. And in the same structure, we have to provide an environment where the anima and the animus, right, can work it out. They can fight it out in a place where, like, we're not going after you as a person. We're going after the things that you think. And we want you to defend them, and we want you to come at us with them. And so your individual, like a payman or a similar one, who brings people into a space and says, these are the rules of engagement, right? So it's blood sport, but it's with words. And the purpose is not so that there is a victor, but so that there is you find common ground. That's it. Right? So the goal is simple, right? Ignore all the nuance, find common ground. And where's the common ground? I, as a human, have an obligation before God to defend your dignity from attack.
Yeah.
That's it. It's not about respect or trust. I have an obligation before God to defend your dignity as a human being.
Yeah. Right. All that is true. But here's the problem. This is the rub. That the nature of that inquiry that you're talking about there for us is we're trying to get at the truth. For example, in the marriage in the marriage counseling situation there, the marriage counselor is trying to bring out what's the truth about what's happening in the relationship, because from there you can start to look at solutions at common ground and create, hopefully, ways to peaceably reconcile those parties. So it's a truth that's a truth-based inquiry. The goal is truth. For the other side, let's call them the left, the goal of that inquiry is not truth, it's power. So if your goal is power, you don't care how that's arrived at. It can be achieved through censorship laws. It can be achieved through a rigged election. It can be achieved through an assassination. It doesn't matter. That part's irrelevant. But if you're in a truth-seeking inquiry, you're quite right. The way that you arrive at that truth is vitally important, because if you don't have a process, a truth-based inquiry that has integrity, you have no chance of arriving at the truth. I used the example earlier of the scientific method or the adversarial system, which is the way that we resolve disputes civilly in courts. There are all kinds of procedural protections that are built into that process that are aimed at arriving at some semblance of the truth. It's a truth-based inquiry. The left is not interested in truth. That's the problem. That's the disconnect. If we can get them, as Andre says, he uses his word, if we can invite them into a milieu where they're in a truth-based inquiry, we can get back to that, or I should say, move forward to that. That would be a seismic shift, because that's the problem. That's the conflict. We want to talk about objective truth. For Christians, that objective truth is embodied in one man who said, "I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life." You know, for them, this concept of truth is something that's relative, and it's achieved. It's a way to manipulate language in order to achieve a particular result, which always aims at power.
Well, Mr. Grey, you've been more than generous with your time. So on behalf of my co-host, I want to thank you for coming here and sharing your wisdom with us. I guess in closing, if you could tell the audience where they can go to follow you, learn more about you, and also where they can go to buy your book.
Yeah. So thanks. First of all, thanks very much for having me here. It's been my great pleasure to talk with you, and really appreciate the engaging questions. My show is called Gray Matter. It is you can find us on anywhere you can find podcasts: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Podbean, and we have a lot of great content on there that hopefully you'll find meaningful. The book is available on Amazon. It's called Lies, Laws, and Liberties. It's a collection of short essays that are on topics like the ones that we've been talking about today. But most of them, I think, I tried to pick out some of the more salient things that are impacting Canadians today. Things like, mass immigration, things like, climate change, things like, the institutionalization of Marxist policies in our law and in society, things like transgender ideology. So we treat all of those, and everything is through a Christian conservative lens, much of like what you've heard today. So I hope people will find that meaningful. But that's where they can, they can find the book. But anyway, it's been a real pleasure talking with you gentlemen today and having this chance to speak to your audience.
Again, thank you very much for coming on, and a big thank you to the audience as well for tuning in.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you too, Leighton. Thanks a lot.
Happy Thanksgiving to you all.